I think before I go any further, I want to introduce you to a software. It's a freeware. I've been using it for, I don't know, 10 years about. It may be helpful as you prepare your presentations. This is called Orphan View, and it's basically Photoshop. It has a function that I don't know that Photoshop has. It basically works the same as Photoshop in most ways. And so it's you can touch things up and stuff, but that's not, you won't need that in this class probably, but you might need this one function that it has, and it might be useful to you in other, for other classes too, and in other things that you might do. As I said, it's a freeware, so it costs you nothing. You can just look up the name of it, IRFANVIEW, up in the upper left-hand corner, Orphan View. And it, like I said, it functions very, very similarly to Photoshop. There are lots of instructional videos on YouTube, so you can figure out how to use it looking at the YouTube videos. But there's one function that, as I said, might be particularly helpful in this, in that it may help you with capturing some of the graphics. For example, if you're looking at a PDF and you need to capture a graphic out of the PDF, you'll get a little bit higher quality with this, and you save it as where you want to save it and in the format that you want to save it. So all you have to do is hit one finger C for capture, and you get this command box for capture setup. There's it should default more or less as you see right now. Some of the things you might not necessarily want. This, for example, will capture the mouse at the same time, so this is useful when I'm teaching desktop publishing or other software. I like to record the mouse, and so when I go up and show, like right now, as I'm showing you how to use Orphan View, for example, under, well, it's open here. Let me show this part first, but I could show you then just some options, like whether or not you want to show the mouse cursor. This is the default, but it's a good one. Control F11 will capture whatever you're looking at on the screen. I usually just stay with a full desktop. You have some options you can play with, sizes you can play with. But the key here is the save capture image as, first off, you get to name it. So in my case, I put name, and they'll put numbers behind them, so it'd be history 001, history 002. So keep them in order, but it also gives you the day, time, and minute and second when you capture that image, in case you're trying to remember. And you get to save it where you want to save it. So you hit your browse button, and if you have a particular place you want to save it, say I wanted to save it under pictures, for example, and I could put it under pictures. And that's where it would save it, and I get to save it in the format I want it. So in this case, I usually save it in TIFF as one of the superior quality formats, and hit start. And so let's say this is an old video, so it's kind of let's come out here and find image of Martin Luther King. Not a great image. But if I wanted to capture that for whatever reason, then Control F11. You hear a little ding, makes a little sound, a little tone. And if I go back in and look under pictures, it should be listed there as History 001 on the, I guess that represents the 9th of October 2017 at 9 o'clock 13 minutes and 8 seconds. So it's very specific. If you don't change, you can take some of that off if you don't want it off. And I open that up, and with Orphan View, then I can go ahead and let me see. Mine's defaulted in Orphan View, so I can go ahead and then say I want this part of the image, and up under Edit, I would hit crop selection, cut it down to that. I can take a look at under image. I can do stuff with colors and stuff. I don't know that I could do much with this. There's an auto adjust colors. Might just try it, see what it does. Maybe a little bit better. You can do stuff on your own as well. Under image, you can go in there and adjust them yourself. See, like color corrections, you would be set up with two images. This is what you have currently, and you can start playing with the contrast and see if maybe you can make it even a little better. Just play with that a little bit. Anyway, and saturation, gamma, you just have to play with that a little bit. And you can also take a look at the size under image, see if there's something you want to do with the sizing. This is in inches. It's 6x4 right now. That's probably a good size for it, and you have some other options there. If you happen to capture something that is not oriented the way you want to, you can reorient it, rotate left, rotate right, flip it horizontally, flip it vertically. Like this would have them looking the other direction if I wanted to put them on the other side, and so forth. So you also have under edit, show paint dialog. This is where it becomes more like a little bit more like Photoshop, and now you have all the commands for touching things up that you might want to do. You also then, once you've made your changes under File, I usually go to Save in the original folder, and once I click that, I do still have some options. I can still change its name if I want to keep the original, so if I wanted to just to keep the edited version, I could cut out some of this and just have it be History 001, and I could also at that time change my mind, say I saved it as a TIFF and I want to go online with it. TIFF isn't functional online, so I'd have to go to JPEG or a GIF, and I could go ahead and still change it at that point to a JPEG or whatever, and for another function change the format and just hit save. And if we look back there, now we have two copies of it, the edited copy and the unedited copy. So you can capture even videos when you hit screen print. I haven't done it for a while, so they may have changed it, but at least it used to be that screen print wouldn't copy videos. It would screw things up real bad with the video. You can capture stuff out of videos, you can capture stuff, anything. So you can go into a PDF, for example, if you're looking at a PDF version of the textbook and there's something in there you want, you can just go to Orphan View and capture that photo out of there and save it in the style, in the size, in the place you want to save it. So again, this is Orphan View, free download, and could be very helpful to you in lots of opportunities besides this class. But particularly as you're putting together a PowerPoint, there are just times when it's helpful again, to capture, not just to capture, that's just one function, but any of the editing functions I just demonstrated. So again, once you get into it and you find what you want to, say I wanted to copy that. Again, in order to start the function, I just hit C in the keyboard. Oops, I need to be in here to do that. C in the keyboard allows me to tell it what I want it to capture. So just C, not Control C, just C. When you're inside of Orphan View, just C. Get it started. And once you start it, it stays on until you turn it off. But I'll go ahead and hit start again. And it confused it because I was already using it. I'm presuming it will still work. That I didn't screw it up too bad. But anyway, say I have somebody's PowerPoint, say I saved somebody's PowerPoint in a PDF format and I needed to capture something out of it. Within PowerPoint, by the way, you can save all this stuff in a graphic format. I'll come back to that. But anyway, again, I can just hit Control F11. It still should be set on putting into pictures because that's where I left it. So here's now that, and I can crop it down to what I want it to be, and go again to edit and crop selection, and go to File and Save in the original folder. And in this case, I'm going to just leave it as it is, and it will replace the original one with the edited version. And so if I go back under Pictures, now it's the edited version that I've saved in there. So anyway, it can be useful to you. Just wanted to show that to you as you're preparing your PowerPoints. It, like I say, could help you in that process. The other thing, I was just mentioning, I don't know when this would become of value to you, but in case you don't know, I use PowerPoint sometimes even when I'm creating graphics for videos and stuff, because what I can do is go to File, Save As, and under Save As, I can, I have to tell it where I want it to be. I'll go ahead and accept where it's at. Then I just have to change this. Rather than doing a Save As a presentation, I can go in here and make a Save As JPEGs or TIFFs or some other graphic. And so say I want to put it into, well, if I'm doing movie editing offline, then I can use TIFFs still with a better quality. If I'm making web pages, I need to use JPEG. But whatever it is I choose, I'll use JPEG this time. I hit Save. It asked if I just want the one slide that I'm looking at, or if I want all the slides. In this case, I'll hit All Slides to show you how quick and easy it is. Once I hit All Slides, then it tells me that saved them into that folder as a subfolder. And so if we go back to that subfolder, we'll find now there is a subfolder called Making Powerful Presentations, and all the slides in the PowerPoint have been saved as JPEGs. So you may find that also helpful at some point to turn your PowerPoints into JPEGs or TIFFs. You might only want one out of there and say, I want to put this into a video, or I want to put it into a Word document as a graphic in a Word document, or whatever. You can use PowerPoint in creating graphics. For example, I don't have it plugged in. I don't know if let me see if I have it up here. Well, if I wanted to, for example, use some of the capabilities of creating, a nice title page to a video, I can create a page like this as a title page in my PowerPoint, and again save that as a JPEG, and I can put that onto a video. I can put that into. That's how I sometimes make. Put it into web pages. So when I put YouTube videos up on YouTube, or put videos from this class up on YouTube, I create a cover page for it and upload that to YouTube, and it makes that what you see when you're searching for it, and you see the name of the video. It's made with PowerPoint, and I just saved. So another function that you just hit File, Save As, tell it where you want to save it, and then change it from a presentation to TIFF or JPEG or whatever you want to save it as. So another hint for improving some of the stuff you might be doing. Okay. Need that one. Also wanted to finish up the PowerPoint that we started last week real quick, get that done. We covered most of it, but there were just a few things that we didn't finish talking about. So I'm going to go into there and open that up again. So last week we were talking about the relationship of media and culture, and we went through all of these slides, and I won't repeat the ones we were already going through, that we already went through, but we kind of got stopped at the Beatles, I think is where we stopped. Let's see, we talked about the show ratings for such, in the history of TV a little bit, on how that particularly how gatekeepers, that's this slide here, have an effect on culture. So people like Ed Sullivan, I mentioned, was a journalist in New York who started the Ed Sullivan TV show, and when TV was just getting going in America in the 1950s, and it became perhaps the most popular TV show at the time. And as I mentioned, anybody who wanted a big boost in their ratings would volunteer to come perform on Ed Sullivan, because they would suddenly, their record sales, if they were musicians, would take off. If they were magicians, they would suddenly have more bookings. If they were comedians, they would have more bookings. So anybody who appeared on Ed Sullivan was suddenly had, maybe 60 million people watching them, and talking the next day with everybody. As I mentioned, there were only 3 networks at the time, no cable, anything like that. So the next day, everybody was talking about what they saw in Ed Sullivan, and so you not only had had their fame and ultimately their fortune being promoted by the TV show directly, but you also have what we still are experiencing, when you have some viral effect when people talk to people and they spread it by word of mouth. That's sometimes just as important. And so when there were just a very limited number of networks in America, then the tastemakers like Ed Sullivan had much, much power. We didn't, I don't think we talked about Convergence. I think that's where we basically stopped, as I recall. I wrote down slide 29. Well, maybe we did talk about it a little bit. Let me talk. I know I didn't talk about it very much. If I did, so I want to maybe talk a little bit more about economic convergence. There's different types of convergence. We normally, in this day and age, when we talk about convergence, we're talking about technological convergence, where all the media are converging onto the internet. And as I've mentioned before, that's almost inevitable. It may take a while in places like Malaysia and Indonesia for your newspapers to disappear, but it will happen. One of the things that, when the Indian students challenged me on that idea, because their newspapers are prospering and they don't see them disappearing anytime soon, and it may not be soon, but they will disappear. As I mentioned to them, one thing that you can count on is innovation. And people will gradually, people will innovate to match the needs of the audience, because if they can capture the attention of the audience, then the audience is valuable. Media make their money by selling your attention. That's how they make money. That's how YouTube makes money, how Google makes money overall, how Facebook makes money. They're selling your attention, the time you spend on their medium. The same as at newspapers, same as TV stations, they are selling your attention. That makes the ability of somebody to create attention-getting material, whether as a journalist, as a photographer, whatever role they're fulfilling, your ability to capture people's attention makes you valuable. And so the best journalists are the ones who write in such a way and report in such a way that that people read their stuff. They get on the front page more because their editors appreciate their material. And so you can become, if you're really good, you can turn journalism into a multi-million-dollar career. And that's true in lots of other areas, even teachers. Nowadays, because of the internet, a teacher can turn his career into a multi-million-dollar career because they reach out to the whole world. I don't know that he's making multi-million dollars, but Salman Khan, some of you I think we talked about him. I don't think most of you are familiar with Salman Khan, but Khan Institute offers free education and I know that Bill Gates has donated many millions of dollars to his nonprofit organization. So as a nonprofit organization, Salman Khan may not be collecting millions of dollars, but he could easily if he wanted to, because he's worth it. He was not trained as a teacher, but he's an excellent teacher, and his institute is amazing. His online institute is fabulous. So basically, whatever you can do, if you can get people's attention, you can sell that. I did a video with one of my former students who's now making YouTube her career. She's a young lady from Kazakhstan, one of the remote countries of the world that most people don't even know of, but she found a niche on YouTube, and she now has been her videos have been seen by 20 million people. She has nearly 500,000 subscribers to her channel, and that becomes valuable. She gets paid for advertising on it, more than what YouTube pays her. Other advertisers come to her and say, "Will you help endorse our product somehow?" And they'll pay her more if she does a direct endorsement as part of one of her videos. So even somebody stuck in Kazakhstan who's about your age can make money by figuring out how to get people's attention, as she has. And that, she thinks, will be her career based around what she's already done. I mean, if you have 500,000 subscribers to your YouTube channel, you've got a good foundation to do lots of stuff. And so that's where she's at right now. Already she hasn't graduated yet, so she might be 21, I guess, at this point. So with a little bit of training and some innovative ideas, you could do it too. Anyway, so we mostly talk about how, what I was going to say, I guess I missed my point, is what I told the Indian students is somebody's going to come along and ultimately they're going to create an electronic device that your people will accept. It may take a while and it'll become cheap enough that your people will accept it. And they now have what they call surface computing. And because anyway, with surface computing, you can turn the wall into a computer. You can turn a piece of glass into a computer. You can turn your tabletop into a computer. And it anyway, so literally, they're working on making a piece of paper your entire newspaper. And so you can literally fold up your newspaper and put it into your pocket, but it's actually attached to the internet, and you're just doing something real quick to change pages. You can save stuff on it. It's just a piece of paper. So how in the world would people in India not accept a piece of paper, what looks like a piece of paper, in lieu of lots of pieces of paper, and have everything have even more than they have if they're carrying around a 50-page newspaper, and they can do it with one sheet and just change pages electronically. So at some point, when we get to something like that, they're going to switch, and people here will switch. There are other options too. I designed one that I never really seriously took out to manufacturers, but I still think it's better than what's on the market right now. Because I asked myself the question, what would get my 80-year-old mom to read a book or a newspaper off an electronic device? And I was actually doing this before the mobile rage. It was in 2001, I think it was, when I was designing this. And maybe it's still, like I said, I think better than what's on the market. But I made mine look like a book. And so it hinged, but it had the two screens linked, like you can do with regular monitors. And so with one touch button, you'd go to your library, open up an electronic book, and you'd read it like a book. And you could, for older people like my mom, you could increase the size, of course, so you can read the type better. And you just, with a flick of the finger, change pages. It looks like a book. It functions like a book, So I thought she would be comfortable with that. And with one touch button, go to a newspaper that's sponsoring this device. One touch button, go to your TV channels, and so you can watch TV on it. One touch button, go to the web to the World Wide Web. And anyway, so just make it seem more natural for somebody who's resisting a current mobile device, because it looks like a book and it acts like a book, kind of. And anyway, but something's going to come along, and everything's going to converge on the internet. Unless the entire world economy collapses and the World Wide Web collapses, it's going to happen. And that's just going to happen. So technological convergence is happening as we're talking right now. I mentioned before, the newspapers in America have already lost 2/3 of their advertising. Many of them are deeply in debt. They're going broke. It's just a matter of time. They have not done anything to take their advertising and their audience. They've never done anything very effective to get them to go onto the internet for themselves, and so they're just going to go broke. Unless one of my chapters in the book I co-authored last year explained to them how not to go broke, but I don't think anybody's reading the book because it cost $300. It was an academic book, and academic books cost too much money. So probably the people in the industry have never read it. Every indication I have is almost all the newspapers in America are going to be broke within the next 10 years. They'll be gone. And those that survive will be on the internet, and otherwise there'll be new online publications to replace them, and the world is changing. Other types of innovation, of convergence, however, are also relevant to our discussion of media history. The economic convergence, I think I did mention, is converging in different directions. So a vertical convergence, a newspaper might buy a paper mill to create create the paper they print on. And a lot of newspapers, big newspapers or big chains, have done that to secure their paper supply. Because there have been times in the past when there have been strikes, either truck strikes or whatever, and they haven't been able to get to their paper. And so by owning the paper mill, they can figure out a way to go get their paper if they have to. So some have gone vertically, some have gone many have gone horizontally, which is basically buy lots of newspapers. So you have these newspaper chains. It's kind of, it's debatable whether if you're a newspaper, you buy a TV station, is that vertical or horizontal? You could consider it both directions. Horizontal in the sense that it's another medium, and so it's horizontally just more media, more media, more media. You could consider it vertical if they work with each other, and for example, the TV station takes its news from the newspaper reporters, and the newspaper reporters begin functioning as an important resource for the TV station. Then the TV station is benefiting from that relationship, and that's a vertical relationship then. So vertical is kind of improving your supply chain, so to speak, and you're taking up more functions leading to your success. Horizontal is having more of the same, so more media, more media, more media. And like I said, there's some kind of betweeners that are both to some degree, or can be both, possibly. So we see a lot of that. I think I mentioned right now there are 6 companies that own most of the traditional media in the world. And they, trying to think if I have a slide of that real handy. I might. Let me look real quick. I think I have that on the presentation I gave in India, and I think that's still, that's in my other computer. Let me see real quick if I have it. I may or may not. Okay, I think it's in this one. But it gives you a better idea if you can see it visually. So these companies just own lots and lots of media. So if you look at these six, General Electric, News Corp, Disney, Viacom, Time Warner, CBS, they own 90% of the traditional media that Americans consume, and then a good share of what the world consumes. The founder and CEO of News Corp thinks it's going to be down to about 4 companies soon. But what is not included on this list is Google, Facebook, and the online competitors. So even though a lot of people are freaking out over this, that these guys are controlling all the traditional media, moved from movies to newspapers, they're going broke. I mean, a lot of them are many of their media that they own are going broke. And so you buy, like News Corp owns Wall Street Journal and New York Post. They chose those strategically. Wall Street Journal is one newspaper that might survive because it has a very special audience of people that are interested in economics and business. It might survive. It'll probably still have to transition to the internet, but it might survive. New York Post might last a long time. It might make the transition because it's competing with the New York Times, and the New York Times is more of an international newspaper than a local newspaper. The Post might transition, be the local newspaper for New York City, and might survive because of the huge population in New York City. So they've looked at this strategically. Some of their properties might survive, but still, all in all, out of all nearly 2,000 daily newspapers and 10,000 newspapers altogether in America, within 10 years, it may be down. It will probably be down in less than 100 newspapers, is what I'm estimating in the next 10 years. I could be off a little bit, but it's going to be hard to survive because they have not been able to make that transition online. So you have these companies that own all the traditional media, but they don't own the untraditional media. And Google is huge. They can't buy out Google. Google's not going to sell out to them, I'm sure. Facebook is not going to sell out to them, I'm sure. And those are the two main ones. Twitter is making some new announcements today about changes they're making, trying to become more competitive with Facebook. And it's kind of the next in line, probably online is Twitter. And it's, like I said, it's trying to become more competitive. So you've got these online businesses that are not going to sell out to these guys. They know they're in a incredibly good position, and it would take probably $1 trillion to buy out Facebook, if that. I'm not sure they'd sell out for $1 trillion, which is a big number. This does not include them, and they're the ones that are taking over the world. So if I'm going to worry about anybody, it would be worrying about Facebook and Google and Twitter, but their function is totally different. Where does the news or the content from YouTube, owned by Google, and Facebook and Twitter come from? Who creates all that content? Everybody, right? Everybody creates that content. So the fear of one of them controlling the world's information flow isn't as valid because they don't create the information. And in fact, I'm watching them because I'm watching to see how well they will resist, how much they will resist using their power. And there have been some accusations already that Facebook and Google may have tried to tip the scales a little bit towards Hillary Clinton in the last presidential race, because they were Hillary supporters. But it's ironic that Trump's supporters were the ones that took over the online media, and he won because of his supporters pushing all of his information around the internet. And so he's definitely a social media president. And he did that even though the media he was using were against him. Twitter was against the Twitter owners were against him, the Facebook owners were against him, the Google owners were against him, they controlled YouTube, they were against him, and he won anyway because his followers flooded that social media with his content. And at this point, the owners of the new media were wise enough to not intervene. And if they did intervene a little bit, it was in like their search engines and stuff. There's some accusations they were messing with the search engines a little bit. But if that turned out to be true, there would become a new Facebook that would be controlled by more conservatives. In fact, I have a proposal for that too. I'm trying to get I'm trying to follow up on, see what happens. But I think there is room for a new Facebook that's designed a little different. And that's going to be the big competition, is who can compete with Facebook and Twitter and YouTube. Are there new media that can really compete effectively against them? And what will happen in the future with that? So while this looks bad, it's not nearly as bad as it seems, because a lot of their media are going broke. They will still be, like Disney and, some of those companies are still going to be producing movies, obviously. But a lot of these other things that they control are losing value very quickly. Some of them own cable networks, for example, throughout the United States. Cable's losing its audience very quickly. I think I mentioned already, once they lose their audience, the reason the local TV stations are surviving because of their retransmission fees, that these cable stations have to pay them money for putting their content on their local cable networks. And so the local TV stations are dependent on cable, and cable's audience is dropping and dropping and dropping. And so the cable is going to disappear. It's going to all move online. With that, the local TV stations are going to be in trouble, big trouble economically, because that's what's keeping them afloat right now. So anyway, everything's changing. Okay, I think it's all I'm going to minimize that. I might come back to that. There are some other ideas that might be interesting, possibly. Okay, so, economic convergence, we had all this media converging onto 6 corporations. And that, like I say, has been a concern. I think it's, even though some predict there'll be even fewer corporations controlling that media, that's traditional media. It's not Google, it's not Facebook, it's not Twitter, it's not whatever else new comes up online. They need to, if they want to survive, they need to be a competitor of Facebook and Google. And so far, none of them have been able to break into that arena. The organic convergence, I think I mentioned, is basically what happens to us as human beings as we become part of this system. In a very real way, we are all part of a huge computer. You can actually think of the entire World Wide Web as a huge computer. We're all linked together. All the computers in the world are linked together with this one network. Thus, we are part of, and we as the people who function with these computers are part of the network. We are, in a sense, part of a huge computer, or at least a huge computer network. Our function with it is vital. We are producing the content to that huge computer network. And we are organically changing because of it. The way we think is changing. There's been a number of studies that suggest that the way we think is changing because of the internet. Our brains are literally changing because of the internet. For good or for bad, some are afraid of it. Some think it's actually better. We're learning to multitask better. We're learning to capture things faster. But there's a negative side to that some people see too. We have short attention spans. So it's having a negative effect on us as well. But it is changing our brains, and it's changing the way we live. I remember mentioning that one study showed that the average American is consuming media 8 hours a day, but they're actually consuming about 12 hours worth of media because they're multitasking with their media. So they're watching a movie while they're Facebooking. So they're doing 2 media at once. So they're actually doing 12 hours of media in 8 hours. That's a huge amount of time that they're spending on media, which is kind of scary to some of us. But it also represents a totally change of not just lifestyle, but way of thinking, again, in the way they're multitasking. That they're watching their favorite show and they're Facebooking their friends or whatever, saying what they like about the show. They're sharing their ideas, whatever they're doing simultaneously, and they're multitasking. So there is an actual effect on the organisms. We are the organisms that are being affected by this, and literally changing our brains. Culturally, this is, when you're talking about cultural convergence, I know I mentioned this too, but like the spread of characters, you build a character in a comic book and it moves to the movies, or it may move to TV, to cable, to Netflix or whatever. A lot of spreading cultural convergence, and very, very closely related to that is the global convergence, and that the ideas of one country spread to another country. I mentioned some of the horror movies, or monster movies and stuff in Japan have become American movies in Hollywood and so forth. Okay, so I just want to re-emphasize that we went over very, very quickly the other day. I know I talked about this also a little bit, but still, again, this is a little bit about the organic effect. Some of this was happening before, even before the World Wide Web. Towards the end of the 20th century, a lot of this was developing. There was a lot more questioning of people's solutions that have, whether it be communism or whatever. I mean, the whole Soviet Union collapsed because they were questioning whether it was viable. Of course, China found a different way to make it viable by having free market and maintaining communism. Although the two seem to be incompatible, they have made it somewhat compatible. But the Soviet Union was basically convinced that it wasn't compatible, so they just dissolved, which I'll be talking about a little bit later in the class, because it relates to communication. So, there's a questioning of whether these these all-encompassing solutions that people have proposed, whether they be governmental solutions or sociological solutions or even scientific. There's scientific revolutions going on all the time, and people are becoming much more skeptical about whether the status quo is true and accurate. Even down to, like I said, even down to science. For example, there's still a very huge portion of the population that questions global warming, and that subject has become very politicized. Of course, the United Nations pushes global, at least change anyway, climate change they're calling it now, because there is some evidence that perhaps overall the world is not warming that much, but it's changing. So sometimes we're having a lot of melt off in the poles, but then other parts of the world are getting colder. They're having colder winters, and just the whole process is changing the climate. And when you look at the overall temperature of the world, it's not necessarily warming the world, even though that's the way it started. That was the alarm, was this warming the world. They conveniently changed the name of it to climate change because some of the evidence wasn't adding up right. And it may yet be global warming. I'm not saying it isn't, but there is a large, even scientists who oppose the idea, and they're saying, no, this has become politicized. You guys are rigging the information. It's not true. Other people are jumping all over these hurricanes that hit America this year, saying this is proof, that the global warming has caused all these hurricanes. At least climate change has caused these hurricanes. Anyway, so there's lots of denial, lots of fragmentation in the way we think. Part of it again is that you can go, there's so much information on the internet, you can become a believer in just about anything you want to be and support it with very convincing YouTube videos and other information. There's a fairly large segment that doesn't believe that 9/11 was, that the Twin Towers were brought down by terrorists. It seems like they pretty much admitted they did, but nonetheless, there's doubters that they could have done what they, bring down those two buildings the way that it appeared to happen. And so there's people that find support for that on the internet, and they are strong believers in denying that the terrorists brought down the Twin Towers in New York City. There are still people, just about any belief you can come up with, there's so much information out there now that you can find support for whatever you want to believe. And I mean almost anything. Some of it is appalling to me, what you can find on the internet. Nonetheless, it's there now. And so whatever your leaning happens to be, and somebody captures your attention and you get focused on something and you don't look at the other counter arguments, you can get sucked into all sorts of amazing ideologies right now because all of it's on the internet. All of it's there. And now you can and if I mentioned before, because of cognitive dissonance, the idea that you do not like having your ideas challenged in your brain, you will then, once you get sucked into an idea, you start looking for more information to support your idea, and you kind of don't want to listen to the stuff that hurts your brain, that opposes what you think. And so once you get into something, you get into this groupthink mode, and you get more and more convinced into what you think is true, and that could be anything, literally anything, because it's all out there. And with lots of support for all of it, what appears to be strong support, and we're not listening to the opposing sides as much anymore. So thus, America has become extremely polarized, a dangerous place, I think, right now, in a lot of other parts of the world as well. And this all relates to the postmodern era, that people are questioning everything, looking at all the other options, and they're adopting their own way of thinking. So it definitely is correlated with the new media, but it actually began before that. It began, like in America, it began probably with such things as the Vietnam War, and people questioning whether that was a righteous war, whether they should have been involved in Vietnam at all, and other things like that. So they start questioning the government's involvement, and that idea spread to where I would say the majority probably of professors in America are probably teaching that America should not have been involved in the Vietnam War. The majority probably, because the professors are more liberal than the average population in America. The average population probably still more or less supports it, has some doubts about it, not sure about it, but the liberal professors are definitely going to be presenting their ideas that it was a bad war in many, many ways to the students. And so it's, anyway, you have this, again, this polarization within academia, polarization within the media, polarization within science, polarization all over the place with people going different directions. And it has only been augmented and greatly augmented by the electronic media that we have today. I put this up for you to watch. I hope you watched it. Clay Shirky goes through the different important eras. As I mentioned, I did mention the other day, he sees those 5 major changes, revolutions as he would call them, revolutionary changes in the way we communicate. We talked about that already. I do want you to watch that video. I'll be asking, in fact, I may ask some questions later today on that subject. Hopefully you watched it. But that's an important aspect. So he talked about the revolutions and how it's leading us today, as we talked about where we start getting, I talked about the earthquake in China and the effect we're going from this to this and what that means. One of his conclusions is that somebody who wants to be successful on the internet, and I didn't talk about this the other day, if you really want to be successful on the internet, you need to learn to be satisfied with convening the discussion and not controlling the discussion. because if you think you're going to totally control the discussion, you're going to be hard pressed to do that, because there's so much interaction between the audience, and they can talk back. The audience can talk back to you. They can talk with each other. So the conversation that you convene, so to speak, on whatever subject, politics, science, whatever, it's out of your control now. If you're the President of the United States, it's out of your control. You cannot control the conversation anymore. And so the best you can do is convene it, kind of give it some direction, share your ideas, but realize you're not in control anymore. It's a whole different situation than it was just 20 years ago or whatever. Very different. You saw this also. This I also put up on our website. And if you looked at this, what was the impression? Anybody watch this video? Tell me your impression of the video. Nobody watched it? You should watch it. If you watch it, you're going to see that it's nothing like current music videos, because this was the first one, almost literally. There were a few music videos coming about at this time, but this was one of the best music videos at the time that MTV was started. MTV was the first cable music station that was just running music videos all the time. So there were enough that it felt like it could start a channel, a cable channel, but it was in its infancy. Music videos were in their infancy. And so you're not going to see anything. This is not anything like today's videos. Amateurs, including my student, my former student from Kazakhstan, makes better videos than this, music videos than this, because she has the technology. She has, she sees where things are going. She can kind of copy the approach that other good musicians take, and so her, this person with using a relatively cheap camera and with Adobe Premiere in her computer can make these guys look like idiots comparatively. So everything has changed, and you should watch that just to see, just kind of bring you back in time. This was, I think it was in 1979, I believe, is what we concluded. And so, in the era of the world, this is not that long ago, and yet everything has changed. And just kind of suggest, kind of represents the world, how the whole world has changed. In America, this is one we did not get to for sure. America has a strong, strong cultural value of free speech that's not shared all around the world. There may be people who say they support free speech, but they really don't. They don't even understand it. Not, at least not the way America understands it and values it. And so in this book, you're going to probably see some reflections of this cultural value, because the textbook was written by an American, and he can't escape his cultural values. In the American Constitution, there's the First Amendment to the Constitution that was passed at the same time that the Constitution was passed. The first 10 amendments, called the Bill of Rights, were passed simultaneous to the Constitution itself, because there was a strong group of people called the Anti-Federalists who would not have supported the Constitution without a Bill of Rights. And so this was number one in the Bill of Rights, protecting free speech in the U.S. Constitution. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. I talked about that before, how around the world at that time most countries had a state religion that was also controlling their society. So it wasn't just the government, but also the religion was controlling it. So they didn't like that. The people who came to America did not like what they saw in other parts of at least the Western world. Great Britain was not just controlled by a government and had a king or queen, but also had the Church of England telling people what to do. And to oppose the Church of England was treason. In Italy and Spain and countries like that, France, the Catholic Church was the official church. And to oppose the Catholic Church was to commit treason. And so you could die, you could be burned at the stake for opposing the church because it also was intertwined with the government. In Germany, it became the Lutheran Church. And some of my distant relatives were persecuted, and some died at the hands of Lutherans, who are seen as a very passive Protestant church. And why they went crazy, I don't know. So anyway, they did not like that. So when we're talking about the First Amendment, it's not just free speech in the sense of being able to talk about politics. They're saying no, there's not going to be any intertwining of religion and politics in our government. So Congress and basically the federal government overall cannot establish any religion. It cannot prohibit the free exercise of religion. It cannot abridge the freedom of speech or of press or the right of people to peaceably assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievances. So that was like I say, that was passed with the Constitution, and the Constitution was only approved because they agreed to put these in. The side who didn't want to put these in still believed in them, but their argument was the Constitution was so simple that basically the federal government was given no rights to do any of these things anyway. So they didn't need it. Their point was that it wasn't needed. And in fact, one of the Federalists argued that if you put these Bill of Rights in, people in the future will twist them. Will twist those words and will turn them upside down. And indeed that has happened. Even in this, it has happened. Because when they said Congress, in the American Constitution, Congress is the legislative body. And therefore, if you said Congress, they're really saying the federal government will not be involved in this stuff. And what they envisioned was that the states, at that time 13 states and grew until 50, that the states would be responsible for all this stuff. So the states would pass laws, because if you think about it, there are laws already that infringe on free speech and free press. Copyright laws infringe on free speech and free press. Libel laws infringe on free speech and free press. The copyright, if you write a book, somebody else can't just take your stuff out of your book and publish it without paying you for it and without getting you to agree with it. That's infringement of your free press, right? If you want to get down to it. Libel means basically you can't write stuff that isn't true about somebody. Now, libel laws are different in different countries. We happen to prefer ours best, which is that is not a crime to libel somebody. In lots of countries, the government uses libel laws to restrict political involvement, because they'll throw you in prison if you say something you don't like, and they say, well, you can't prove that, you're going to prison. Well, that's a distortion of the purpose of a libel law by American perspective. So in America, it's a civil matter, and if somebody libels me, I can go to court and sue you for $10 million, but I can't get you thrown in prison for it. It's not a crime, it's a civil matter. That you've done me harm, you have to pay me for the harm you've done to me. You printed something about me, it was not true. And there's other mitigating factors that could protect you. In fact, the person it's almost impossible for him to win a libel suit is the President of the United States. Once you become that well known and so forth, basically anybody can say anything they want to, and you have no recourse. So in America, kind of the opposite of most countries, the people with the least recourse in court are the most famous, rich, and powerful people in America. They have almost no recourse because they're too well known. Because anything somebody says about you is kind of up for public debate. It's very difficult. A few Hollywood stars have been able to get verdicts now, even though they're very rich and famous. If somebody says something that is not true, and there's reason to think that the people didn't care that it wasn't true, they've been able to win multi-million-dollar suits over that. So there are a few exceptions, but it's very hard for a movie star for a politician in America to go to court and get any compensation for no matter what anybody says against them. It's very hard. Anyway, so the idea was, the people who wrote this, was that this would be a state matter. States would pass laws about libel, would pass laws about copyright, would pass laws about pornography and obscenity, that they would, in fact, there were already laws existing in the states at that time. They expected them to continue. But what they wanted here was the federal government would have no involvement in freedom of speech. Now, the Supreme Court actually flipped that on its head, and the Supreme Court has taken control of all of issues, and so a state, for example, may not want pornography. The Supreme Court says, tough luck, you're stuck with pornography. Now, the idea of the founders was that state would have the right to have tough pornography laws if it wanted to. But the Supreme Court took that over by the fact that it only said Congress and didn't say federal court. And the founders did not think that the Supreme Court would become a legislative body, deciding that pornography was legal. And so the Supreme Court took it over. So there are a number of things that the federal government has taken over and done exactly what the Federalists warned against, was that once they mentioned anything in the Constitution, somebody would twist it and turn it upside down. Because that's exactly, I mean, historically there's no question that what they really intended was that the federal government should have no involvement in it whatsoever. States should consider it should be in charge of all this stuff. And the Supreme Court flipped it upside down and took control of it. There's other issues like that too, where they thought they were protecting the states, and the government turned their words around and took control. Not in ways that are, like dictatorial or whatever, but it's not the intention of the founders. Nonetheless, the value of free speech is a strong part of American culture, to the point where, like I say, it's very difficult to lose a lawsuit for libel. If you're a small newspaper or something and you outright print, kind of what I was saying before, the less famous you are, the easier it is for you to win a libel suit, for example. If somebody misidentifies, or let's say you're arrested for something, you're arrested for, let's say, driving under the influence of an intoxicant of whatever kind, alcohol or drugs. You're arrested for that, and the newspaper suggests that you were guilty before you've gone to trial. You go to trial and you find out, oops, there was a reaction to some medicine, prescribed medicine. So you weren't partaking of alcohol, you weren't partaking of illegal drugs, you were taking some regular medicine and your body reacted to it. And so you were driving like you were drunk. But the newspaper suggests you were caught driving drunk. Well, then you have a libel case against them. And if you're not a famous person and you're not a politician and you're not a movie star, you can probably win some money from that newspaper because they said you were guilty, they suggested you were guilty, and you weren't guilty. You were arrested, you went through a trial, or maybe you didn't even go to trial because they figured out what really happened, that it wasn't your illegal use of an intoxicant. So if you're less famous, you can win a lawsuit. So, but within the overall culture, we understand there is some need for some control, but there's less and less control, actually, in America over free speech, partly because the Supreme Court has oriented that direction. There's very little control over pornography, and partly because of technology. How do you control pornography today? Since pornography is being created in all the countries in the world, basically they could stop all the pornography in America tomorrow and they would still be flooded with pornography. So, and unless you want to shut down unless you want to create a great firewall like China has, you want to have the great firewall of America, you can't control what's coming into your country. And America has chosen not to do that. And I think the American people would not support that sort of control over the internet. They would, because of their commitment to free speech, they don't want the government involved in saying what is, even if it includes pornography, they don't trust them. They don't trust the government to gain control over the internet. They want to leave the internet alone It's the basis of free, one of the stalwarts of free speech now in America is the internet, and they want the government out of leave the internet alone, basically. Another subject that we'll be talking about over the semester might be propaganda. Propaganda is, as it says here, a message that attempts to persuade its audience for ideological, political, or social purposes. The assumption of manipulation through message and or the medium. There is a difference between persuasion and propaganda. Lots of us can be involved in persuasion. Propaganda suggests more of a systemic effort so it's more like public relations. Public relations can be involved in propaganda to try to, and when I say public relations, that also includes government. Government does not admit that they have public relations typically. They call them public information officers. They're still public relations agents. And so public relations agents are involved in propaganda all the time, trying to persuade, trying to sway the thinking of their audience, whatever audience that might be. Radio Free Europe, also here in Asia, is controlled by the U.S. government. So they're going to use that radio signal to try to persuade people in their way of thinking. That is propaganda. Even if it's very subtle, some of it might be very positive. Well, maybe most of it is positive. From my American perspective, I might like all of it, but it is still propaganda, and trying to persuade people to think like Americans think. That's what something like that would be. And so all governments are involved in propaganda, including the American government. And so there's a very thin line between persuasion and propaganda. Again, the propaganda would be more typically using media, typically in a systemic way, trying to figure out how to consistently use the media in such a way as to sway people their direction. Some of it is like, again, the American example that disturbs me a lot, and I think there should be a law against it. I think a lot of Americans do, but I would say over the decades, American governments controlled by both parties, Democratic and Republican parties, have in some cases functioned in a propagandistic way by lying to the public, by lying to the citizens. There was evidence of that in the Vietnam War, I referred to that already, where they made a claim that the American ships were attacked by the North Vietnamese, in a way that justified their going in and doing some bombing in North Vietnam. It turned out it wasn't true. So the American government falsified information to try to get the Americans behind the war. This then later, equally disturbing to me, is that a bureaucrat in the American government released those documents to prove that some of the stuff that they had said during the war were false, that they were trying to manipulate the American thinking. One thing, the positive side, is that the New York Times and the Washington Post, and maybe some other papers, but at least those two, ignored the government when the government said, you cannot print this stuff. This is classified information. The government's classified this information as secret. You cannot print it. And because the newspapers felt like this was a public issue, they said, tough luck, we're going. And they printed it. The Supreme Court protected them against prosecution from the government because because of the free press. However, Daniel Ellsberg, who gave them the information, was sent to prison. And the government did not reverse that just by the fact that the information he gave to the newspapers, the public should have known. That part disturbs me. To me, the court should have said, okay, what he released should have been released because it should never have been secret. The government should never have lied to the people, therefore this information should never have been secret. But the court still supported the idea that the government should be able to keep secrets. And so there's a line there where I think a lot of Americans would be opposed to, and more recently as Obama with Benghazi. His administration said over and over again that it was a video that had incited this riot, so to speak, and that it was organic, that it wasn't caused by any of the terrorist groups. And if anybody's seen the movie, I mean, it's not just a movie. WikiLeaks broke this. I was talking about you have the mainstream media, and you have this media that the mainstream media like to call fake media, and fake news. The conservatives, by the way, call them fake news, so it's kind of going back and forth. But they try to make a case against some of these organizations as being fake news organizations. And I'm not saying that everything that they print is true. I'm not saying that. But neither is everything that the mainstream media is saying is true either. And they're controlling the agenda, and that's even so. When you control the agenda, you get to, well, I think I shared this saying before, you don't get to control how people think, but you get to control what they think about. Because if the mainstream media says this is the issue, Trump is doing stuff illegal, that's the issue, then everybody's talking about that issue. And nobody's talking about anything else that maybe the Democrats are doing bad. Because they're totally focused. They've controlled the agenda and made this what everybody's talking about. So they don't control how you think necessarily, although they do bias the news too. There's evidence that they bias the news also by, I think I mentioned what sources they use, how they write their stories. They still bias the news, but just as effectively as they control, again, what people are reading and writing about by putting that in the news agenda for all Americans. So it's that's problematic. But what I was getting to is Benghazi. They were trying to say is this anti-Muslim video that had started this, and it was clear. One thing that WikiLeaks released during the campaign was that at the same time that Hillary was saying that it was a video, that she wrote to her daughter that it was Al-Qaeda. And so she knew it was Al-Qaeda all the time. There's an Al-Qaeda-backed organization that had done this, that it was well organized, they had good weapons, that it was not a spontaneous outcry against this video. And so the entire, this was basically 1 month, well, actually it happened 2 months before the election. And Obama may not have even been elected that second time if the truth about Benghazi had been released to the people during that 2-month period of time. I was following both the mainstream media and the fake news media that they proclaim. Fake news media knew it immediately. They knew exactly what was happening. Before the election, I even knew something that was only released even by WikiLeaks during this last year. So this was again in would this be 2012 when this occurred. They already knew that part of what was going on was that the Americans were taking some of the weapons out of Syria, or out of Libya, and sending them to Syria. And they were supporting some of the rebel causes in Syria, including ISIS, with weapons they were confiscating in Libya. And that somehow the ambassador who was killed was actually there to meet with a Turkish official about the weapon exchange, the weapon flow from Libya to Syria. That was touched on. WikiLeaks released part of that, but that was proclaimed by one of the fake news organizations in the fall of 2012, before the election, that could have really killed the Obama campaign. But they classified it all, lied about it all, and controlled the campaign with their lies. And so this happens everywhere, not just in communist worlds where they have a little more control over the media, but in a different way in America too, by the system of classified information. They proclaimed this classified. The Obama administration was giving lie detector tests to key people who could have told the truth to Congress or to the media, were threatening to send him to prison if they told the truth about what happened in Benghazi. He was using every power he could come up with. During this time, he was wiretapping journalists. No other president had ever done that before. Obama administration was wiretapping journalists and they were accusing the journalists of being part of the crime by releasing the classified information in order to get that warrant to wiretap them. And so that was scaring, that was scaring the journalists, that was scaring any possible source, because that source was giving information. In fact, they weren't just wiretapping, at least there's some evidence that they were bugging their computers. That one of the top investigative reporters on Benghazi somebody got into her computer and put a virus in there, whatever, that would allow the government to spy on what she was doing, is her accusation. She's actually still in court. She's made the accusation and is trying to take the government to court over it. So propaganda and persuasion are cousins, so to speak, but it gets bigger than just releasing, it's bigger than Radio Free Europe or Radio Free Asia. It's much bigger than that when you talk about how you try to control the way people think. And that's the U.S. government has been as guilty of that as just about anybody. People with power want to keep power, whatever system they're working under, which is, by the way, another reason why the postmodernist skepticism about everything, because this stuff has been revealed, and so people become skeptical. They used to trust the President of the United States. Everybody in America revered and trusted the President no matter which party he was in, and now they distrust no matter what party they're in. Media literacy then is in part, how do you know when something's propaganda and when it's not? I had to admit to somebody the other day, I'm a trained journalist. If anybody should, and I'm an academic, and I'm a researcher, if anybody should be able to tell, I should be able to tell. I can't tell anymore. It's so messed up. It's so polarized that just with this Las Vegas shooter, this guy that shot and killed 50 people and wounded about 500 people, immediately there were videos coming out showing what they claimed to be a different shooter. There's people being interviewed that says that they were there on site and they're convinced there was somebody not just shooting from the hotel, but somebody on the site shooting people, and they were scared they were going to get shot. They were inside of a tent. They were hiding inside of a tent. There are people who swear up and down there were multiple shooters. They could hear them coming at different times. There's all this stuff that at first the government was denying altogether. Now the sheriff is saying he thinks this guy could not have been working alone. He had cameras set up so he could tell if anybody was coming after him. He knew who was in the halls. He knew who was in the main lobby. He had cameras posted throughout this place. He had whatever it was, 20 guns to shoot and all this supply, and had got all that in there. He had explosive materials in the room and in his car. He was ready for a war. And yet he didn't seem to be anybody who had the expertise in this stuff. And so even the sheriff is starting to admit now, several days later, we're not so sure he worked alone. This is just too much going on. But right from within hours of the event, there were skeptics posting stuff, questioning what the government was releasing. And that's a crime. It's just a debate over what happened in an event that doesn't seem to be, it became politicized because most of the people at the event were probably conservatives. They were probably Trump supporters. And you even had some Congress people saying, I hope all those people that died and all the people that were injured were Trump supporters. And they went in public to say that stuff, almost encouraging violence. But anyway, my point is that I wasn't sure. I'm not sure what the truth is, and now the sheriff isn't sure what the truth is, frankly. There's too much information coming in, and how do I know? I remember I was watching InfoWars, which was one of the main organizations that is accused of being fake news. And they do believe stuff that I think is on the edge of being crazy. It's hard for me to believe. They're saying there's going to be a civil war, a rebellion against, I think I mentioned this the other day, there'll be a civil war created to destroy Trump next month. That there's plans already to cause, to have open warfare if necessary to overthrow the Trump administration. I can't believe that. I just don't believe that. I don't think that's possible. Among other things, one of the other complaints of the liberals is that conservatives all have guns. So the conservatives have millions and millions of guns in their households. Liberals don't believe in guns, so they don't have guns. And so it would have to be, in order to go against the conservatives and go against Trump, it would have to be like a coup. It would have to be a military coup. Or they would have to just incite total riots in the cities. I don't see it happening. I don't see it happening. But they believe in this secret government is controlling things in the background, and they're going to overthrow Trump. I don't believe that. I think InfoWars is going off the deep end on that. But meanwhile, live, I was listening to one of their broadcasts, and live they had somebody coming online who was at the site of this shooting and giving them information that the government wasn't releasing. And this gal was there. And so how can I doubt her? I mean, still, it's just one witness, but her testimony was that there were multiple shooters and stuff like that, and she was there. And one of the testimonies of these people is that somebody went up to the stage about 20 minutes before the shooting started and said, "You're all going to die," and kind of gave them a warning, and they pushed her out of the arena and sent her away. Thought she was a crazy person. 20 minutes later, the shooting started. Who was she? Nobody knows who she was. They just kicked her out of the place as being a wacko. So anyway, my point is that trying to figure out what is propaganda and what is truth, what is news, there would be some that would suggest that you need to trust the traditional media in order to have any knowledge at all. You need somebody to help you sort through what is true. And if the mainstream media had not gone totally off the deep end in this campaign against Trump, I would almost support that idea, that you have to come down to trust the news media. But right now, I don't trust the news media. I don't know which medium I would, if I lean towards a medium, it might be Fox News, but I know they're also very opinionated. They have a lot of commentators that are conservative, but I happen to agree with their commentators. So I support them more than the other media because they reflect my values, my personal political values. And so, but I know they make mistakes too, and I know they have somewhat of an agenda. They're also owned by one of these 6 companies. Rupert Murdoch with the News Corps owns Fox. I know he has his own, he's not a real strong hands-on owner. He's more into it for the money, but he owns mostly conservative media, which actually, for me, means I like him more than some of the other people, other big media, who promote more liberal, again, from the American definition, liberal meaning pro-government positions, bigger government. So if it's tough for me, all I can say is be postmodern. Question everything. Question everything any government says, including mine. Question everything. Question scientific. When you see it become politicized, there's reason to question it, because it means somebody's in power, somebody's trying to gain power over something. And so I do question global warming. I'm not against it. I don't know. I simply don't know. One of the alternatives, by the way, the world climate has changed many times in history, to where the poles, the North Pole, used to be around the equator. And it has changed during different periods of years to where it's shifted from being just 90-degree change to where the poles are where they're at now. So I don't rule out In fact, the idea of the 2012 was that something we were aligning with the galaxy or something, and that the gravitational pull of all the stars and stuff in the Milky Way might cause a shift in the world's axis somehow. And we aren't really capable of knowing exactly what happened in orientation to the rest of the galaxy. That's a science that we have not perfected. Did 2012, did the alignment with the galaxy in such a way, could it affect the alignment of the Earth? Could the poles shift? Well, they shifted before. Somehow they shifted before, and they have multiple times shifted. I don't rule anything out. I'm not saying that did happen. I don't rule anything out anymore. I don't know what to believe anymore. In science, in politics, in international relations, basically I'm skeptical about everything now. I look at the sources. I think about them. I try to, I don't believe everything. Like I said, I don't believe everything InfoWars says by any means. I think they're wackos in some areas. But if they have a good source, they announce some stuff about Benghazi that nobody else had, that none of the mainstream media even touched on for over 6 months. And so they had some good sources. I know that. But they also come to conclusions I don't believe at all, like the civil war that's going to happen. I hope they're wrong. I don't think it. I think they're crazy, but in that sense. So what do you believe? I don't know what to tell you. I've given up. The world we live in right now, the information world we live right now is much too complicated to keep track of. I would just say be skeptical. Yes, look at sources. If you know that something's coming from government, be more skeptical than if it's coming through from a news medium. But news media are also biased. And so you start looking at who controls the news media. Back when Russia invaded Georgia, not the country of Georgia, not the state of Georgia, was, I think, it was my first year in Kazakhstan. And I suggested to the students that they needed to be skeptical about the Russian version of it. But all of their international news was coming from Russia. And so they did not have another perspective. So all they got was the Russian perspective, unless they got on the internet and went to BBC or something. All they got was the Russian perspective on their cable TV news. And they were about ready to hang me. They were so absolutely convinced that Russia was righteous in invading Georgia that they were really upset with me. And all I was really trying to, by the end of the class, I think they were okay. But what I was trying to explain to them was that the government system in Russia allows the government to control their TV channels. And the government system in America does not allow the government to control the TV channels. Otherwise, 91% of all the news in America would not be anti-Trump, because Trump is the president. And so you don't have that happening in Russia. 91% of the stories are not going to come out against Putin as him being the bad guys. Never going to happen. But in America, it is happening right now. In the last 3 months, 91% of the stories done by newspapers and the TV in America have been anti-Trump. And so it's a very different system. Now, that doesn't mean that the American media aren't biased. Absolutely, they're anti-Russian biased. Absolutely. Because of the years of Cold War and everything, they're going to have an anti-Russian bias. Absolutely. But they're not controlled by the government. And so they need to, I suggested they needed to watch the media, the Russian media and the Western media with that in mind. Is that, if anything, the Western media at that time was very anti-Bush. They blamed him for getting us into the Iraq War. They were ready to hang him. So the American media was very anti-government at that time, anti-Bush, and when they invaded Georgia, and yet the media was saying that they were giving evidence that Russia was in the wrong here. I wasn't saying just believe outright the American media. I wasn't saying that at all. But look at the media by who controls the media. In Russia, the government controls the media. In America, these corporations control the media, basically, those 6 corporations. They will have biases. but understand their biases. Where are they coming from? What is it? Their cultural bias against Russia in that case? Is it their political bias as liberals? Is it, where are they coming from? Try to analyze news by what somebody is, who's saying it, what do they have to gain from it, who are they, what do they want to protect, what values are they trying to protect, what information are they trying to protect. As I said, even the U.S. government lies to the news media all the time. Take that into account as a possibility that the government's lying to them, and they're quoting the government, and they're not doing it because they're forced to, because that's a news source. So they go to the government, and Obama says that it was a video that started the Benghazi attack, and they print it. And too many of them printed it without questioning it. They didn't look for any other sources. And so that sort of thing can happen with this Georgia invasion or whatever else. By the time we got to, fast forward 9 years or 8 years or whatever, and the invasion of the Ukraine, by then, I think the students there at that university understood. They understood that they had to look at both sides and understand what the Russian government was saying through their media and what the Western media was saying, and at least try to make some sense out of it all. And that's the best I can suggest to you. You try to make some sense out of it all, but don't believe one or the other outright. Listen to them, evaluate who they might be protecting, what their biases are going to be, who might be lying to them, all those sorts of questions, and try to find. I go out and look for the other side. My blog website has media from the right and media from the left, and I listen to them both, and I write my opinions. Even though I know I have biases towards the conservative side, I need to know what the liberals are saying to understand their perspective. And sometimes I agree with them, and sometimes I think the conservatives are going wacko on something. They get tied up with something, and I think they get their minds warped a little bit on some issues. But anyway, that's the world we live in. So media literacy is very important. It's the ability to decode and process media messages. Increasingly important in a media-saturated era, increasingly possible in an era in which we can be both consumers and producers of the media messages, but as I said, I think increasingly confusing. The Center for Media Literacy has suggest these. The one in yellow I added, and I'll discuss that in a second. All media messages are constructed. You have to understand that somebody constructed them. By the very nature, by definition, all media messages are constructed by somebody. That somebody is going to have prejudices, going to have biases, going to have maybe government control over them in some cases, or government manipulation in other cases. There's something, just understanding that all messages are constructed by people, and they may have other purposes in mind. Media messages are constructed using a creative language with its own rules. So you can bias messages with that language, by the way. If you use the word claim, as you start writing, I'm telling you don't use the word claim unless you're serious about it. Claim is not the equivalent to said. Claim suggests that you doubt it, or there's reason to doubt it. Otherwise, there's no reason to use the word claim unless you're questioning it. And so in your writing these news stories, don't use the word claim unless you really want to challenge it, in which case you should challenge it in the story. If there's something that I say, you say, Dr. Ken claimed, then put in there evidence why you think you should question, or it might be obvious if I'm making a forecast in the future that all newspapers are going to disappear in America, or most of them are going to disappear in America in the next 10 years. Yeah, I would say you might be able to use claim in that one without any follow-up, because not everybody's saying that. Okay, so it is maybe a claim that you could say, I claimed this. But you need to there needs to be a sense in your story why you use that word rather than said. Because you are in essence raising the question of whether that person's right when you use that word. So either on its face, you think the whole audience understands why you use the word, or you give evidence why they should question it, what they said. Different people experience the same media message differently. In other words, our psychology, I mentioned already cognitive dissonance, we can listen to the very same message and get have a totally different response to it. They did some research in Israel and Palestine. They had people in Israel and Palestine watch the same news. And the Palestinians said it was an anti-Palestinian bias, and the people in Israel said it was an anti-Israel bias. Same news, but they equally felt like they was biased against them. So it's just how you perceive that information. Is it coming with bias? Is it not coming with bias? What's in your brain, your conceptual framework, your ability to analyze it. You're going to be more sensitive against stuff that you find offensive to you or questioning your ideas, and you're going to be inclined to believe the stuff that criticizes people that you're opposed to or ideas you're opposed to. And so, again, like in the case of this experiment with the Palestinians and Jews, both people can hear the very same message and both feel like they're being persecuted, or vice versa. And so, how you perceive news is totally individualized, totally individual, based on your conceptual framework. The one in yellow, I put in messages are perceived differently via different media. That's the kind of one of the premises anyway of the media. Media is the message. That you can watch the very same movie on TV and at a theater, and it's a different experience. It's a totally different experience whether you watch it on the big screen in that setting, or whether you watch it on your TV set or on YouTube or whatever. That may not have great it could have political implications. You're going to be much greater, usually more impacted emotionally and so forth in a theater than you are watching it on YouTube. So it could change the way you think quite dramatically, watching it in the theater, not on YouTube. But it's just important to know that, of course, there's a much bigger difference whether you read about something in a newspaper and see it on the TV news. The newspaper is going to have more detail. As I mentioned before, a 30-inch story or a 30-paragraph story in a newspaper becomes an 8-paragraph story in TV. You don't get nearly as much information, but you get to see live video. And you're persuaded by that live video. That live video, by the way, is edited by somebody. And the person who edited that video may change what you see by the way they edited it. You have to watch out for that. Video editing can be very deceptive. Did somebody say, when they show somebody saying something, it could be totally accurate and totally taken out of context. And so when you take it out of context, it could mean absolutely the opposite. He could have been saying just the opposite of what you quoted him as saying, but he was rambling on, and you're able to pull out a sentence here that made him sound like his view was totally different. So video editing can be very propagandistic, how you do that. But so you can control it, but also the experience of it. If you see somebody talking, you take that, you see it on video, they said that, you are convinced it's true. And yet the video editing may have totally turned that person, what he said, totally upside down. His meaning could have been totally different from that. The media that you use is important. Media producers have embedded values and points of view. As I mentioned before, while the American media is not controlled by the American government directly, it may be controlled by their propaganda, by their secret, by what they claim as being secret and so forth. It may be controlled in that way, but ultimately they do not tell a newspaper what to put in the newspaper. They do not tell the TV station what to put on TV. And so the media in America can be very opposed to the government, no matter what they, so in that sense, whereas the Russian media is controlled largely by the Russian government. So, understand that there are embedded values, there's embedded points of view, but there's an organization behind it, and people have motives. If you're a journalist in Russia, your motive is to be in favor with the government because the government's controlling the media. You want to be in favor with the government. You don't want to be, one of the great journalists of all time was an investigative reporter in Russia. I did a video on her. Maybe I'll show that to you sometime. But her investigative reporting sent, I think it's like, I can't remember the exact number, but over 15 people to prison. And people who had a lot of influence, people who, if it weren't for her good reporting, the courts would have favored those people because they were so powerful. But she had so much evidence that 15 powerful people in Russia were sent to prison. And then she was assassinated. You don't want to be assassinated. So that's a motive. I don't want to be assassinated. I don't want to be in disfavor with the government or with these powerful groups. It's a motive. In America, you want a prize. And you sometimes will warp a story, make it a little bit yellow journalistic, a little bit hyped up, because you want to please somebody who will give you a prize, or please people because you share their political orientation or something. So you will have cultural biases because of years of Cold War. So you have cultural biases and political biases against Russia for that reason. There's lots of things that control American journalists as well. They're just different. If you're a Russian journalist or an American journalist, you try to understand where they're coming from and judge the news they put out accordingly. They will have biases. There will be motives behind the organizations they work for. People are trying to gain profit or power from the news. It may be profit in the part of American journalists, profit in the sense of you break the right stories, you get paid more money. You go up in the industry. So there's a profit motive, not saying that you're being bribed by any means, but you want to be well esteemed, and so you are pleasing somebody. So you have to watch out for that profit motive in the American system. Power motive in some cases. You have people in American media that used to be part of the government and would like to be part of the government in the future. They have a power motive. And again, people in Russia have different, motives. The organizations they represent have different motives. In some cases, directly controlled by the government. Sometimes indirectly. In Kazakhstan, there's not very many journalists killed in Kazakhstan, but their newspapers can be put out of business in a different way, including private lawsuits. You get somebody really powerful in Kazakhstan against you, they claim you libeled them, they sue you for $10 million, you don't have $10 million, they bribe the judge, you're convicted, you're out of business. And that has happened. So they have different ways of attacking you. So depending where you're at in the world. So those things are all things that are important to understand. Okay. Well, we are actually out of time. So no questions today. Just a real quick word. I was going to go through this PowerPoint on making more powerful presentations. If we have time, I would like to do it in the other building because this building, the audio-visual stuff doesn't work as well as in the other building. Let's put it that way. But again, let me emphasize, try to get more graphics than the old versions had, especially in the case of the Poe book. Almost no graphics in the book. So those of you that have a Poe chapter to do, look for graphics that will represent it as well as possible. That's one of your main jobs. Obviously, I want you to to present the material. Do not think you have to present all the material. present what you find interesting and you think of a value to everybody, or maybe not everybody, but to the class in large. What would be good for them to remember in the future? Is there anything in here, and you may have a hard time finding that in some cases, especially probably in the poll book more than others. You may have a hard time finding that thing that you think, gee, everybody should understand this and remember this. Well, do your best. That's why I say, find the most interesting stuff you can find, the stuff of greatest value that you can find, and share it with the class. It was kind of a relative, reference, I guess. Get the best stuff, whichever book you're in, and share that. You do not have time to share it all. I've mentioned before, somebody thought, well, gee, it wouldn't really take 30 minutes. Took me, I didn't get done in 2 hours going through some of this stuff. There's plenty of material there to take a long time to go through, but you're to do it in somewhere around, between, actually, well, I think 40 to 60 minutes is what or you could even go a little bit longer than 60 if you really wanted to, which most of you won't. But, find the most interesting stuff and try to get excited about it. Try to get really interested in it. Try to delve into it. And I don't want to, crush the poll book too much. I just think it's more academic, and the stuff that you will find that you think is real valuable for the rest of the class, there might be less of it. Let me put it that way. Emphasize the stuff you think of greatest interest. Try to find illustrations for it. Try to make it more exciting than maybe the book presentation, since the book, like I say, is more like a dissertation than a textbook. Nobody bothered to try to find any graphics for it and so forth. They have a few tables and stuff and charts, but that's about it. So try to make it come alive a little bit. And so that's why I gave you the old version, so that you can see what they did and try to build from that and make it more interesting. So any questions on that? I guess one other thing I want to say is, I did mention it before, but try your best to not read it, but to go from notes. So you can write it out if you want to and read it through a dozen times, so you know what you wrote, you know what you wanted to say, but then try to go from notes. It's going to be very hard for any of you to get an A if your head is down reading the notes, reading your script. The delivery portion, you're going to get killed there in the delivery. And it may even affect some of the other aspects, because in some cases I may not be able to hear you very well, because a lot of you speak kind of softly and you start reading your notes, your voice gets trapped in your computer, people in the back can't hear it, I can't hear it, and I can't give you a good grade in something I can't hear. Whereas if you're standing upright and you're looking at notes, whether it's your PowerPoint notes or other notes that you have, maybe even 3 cards in your piece of paper in your hand, but you're making contact, we're able to hear you better, you're able to see our eyes, and so you can see if we have questioning eyes. So even if none of us ask any questions, there's still feedback coming to you. You can be more spontaneous. And so even though your words are not as perfect as you scripted them, you'll get a better grade. I mean, yes, you could absolutely do a terrible job in trying to go without reading it. And obviously, yeah, I mean, if you really don't think you can do it without reading it, then read it. You can probably get an A- reading it. If you can still try to enunciate clearly, if you can try to raise your head once in a while, know it well enough that you can your eyes can leave your text, and you can look out once in a while, and there are ways that you can actually use the text and still, it's going to be very hard to get an A, but very, very possible to get an A- if you do it well. And in fact, I would say there's some that I've given A's to in that sense, that they did look up enough, they knew their material well enough, they did look up enough that I consider, and they were more expressive, and they maybe had their notes in such a way that they could speak forward and not be down like this all the time. It's possible. I guess it is possible to get an A and read a script, but you're going to have to know it really well and keep in mind all those other things of eye contact, emphasis, enunciation, all those things I talk about in the critique sheet, because that's what I'm grading from. And so my best suggestion is don't read. You can write it and maybe not really memorize it, but go over it enough that you're very comfortable with the content, and then go from your notes. And that's your best chance of getting an A, I'd say. I don't grade real hard on this, but that's one of the main things. I want to be able to hear you. I want to see your eyes. I want you to have some emotion with it. I want you to get excited about what you're talking about, even if it's the Poe book. There is some interesting stuff in there. There really is. And you need to glean it out and try to make it exciting to people. And if you need to, get some information from outside of the Poe book in order to make it more interesting. Whatever you need to do to make it fly, you're the teacher on this. Okay, thank you.